Today I'm building a clock using math and modern design. Now, George Nelson mastered clock design in the late 1940s, so I hope to breathe some life back into his work with this project. Given all the angles, the biggest problem I faced was whether or not my math was correct. So today, let's get into solving those problems on Timber Biscuit. So I started this project just like I do any project by breaking down my lumber. And for this one I'll be using 4/4 walnut because I think it looks great and it's pretty timeless. So the first thing I needed to do was cut my pieces into more manageable chunks. Once I had 4 manageable tree slices, I took them over to my planer to thickness them down, and then over to the joiner to put a clean edge on them. But if I'm being honest, milling lumber is not the most exciting thing in the world, so I've doubled up the content so you don't have to watch the whole process. You're welcome. Alright, so next it was time to cut out some strips that would create my blanks. Now I didn't have boards that were wide enough to get 2 blanks out of each board, so unfortunately I had to use all 4. But if I had wider stock, I definitely could have gotten 2 strips out of each board. I'm also cutting an extra board just so that I have some test pieces to set up my jigs. Anytime I can work test blocks into a project, I definitely will, because those tests are really invaluable. So once I had all 4 boards ripped down to their final width, I could go ahead and swap out my ripping blade for a crosscut blade. And while I'm doing that, I'll take a moment to let you know that if you want plans for this project, like most of the others on my channel, they're linked down in the description below. Alright, so next up was to cut a clean edge on the end of all my boards. And this is important because if we don't do this, it'll throw off all the jigs for the remainder of the build. This is where having a really long crosscut sled comes in handy, because it gives me a large surface area to reference the workpiece against when I'm cutting out these long pieces. Another option would be using something like a miter station, but I really like using a crosscut sled because I feel like the table saw gives me more control. Unlike inflation, which is out of control, but that's just my $5. Anyway, next I could set up a stop block to cut the blanks out to final length. Since each one of these blocks is going to allow me to have 2 triangle pieces, I want to make sure these blocks are long enough to fit both triangle pieces mirroring one another. So this way when we build the sled in a little bit to cut out the triangles, I'll have plenty of space for both triangles in each block. And if that's a little hard to follow, don't worry, it'll all make sense here in a second. So from there I just slide the workpiece down and repeat the cut for each one of the sections. From these 4 sticks I'll end up with 16 blanks, even though I really only need 12, but that's alright, then I have a couple to play around with, and I can swap my triangles in and out if I want to switch up the grain pattern. Alright, so now that we've got all our blanks cut out, I'm going to use the templates that I've cut out over the CNC to set up the sled that's going to cut our angles for all of these. If I've set everything up correctly, then each one of these blanks will give us 2 of our triangle pieces, so we should need 12 of these to get what we need. So let's first get this sled set up and we'll get them trimmed out. Alright, so the first thing I needed to do was create a base for my sled. And to do that, I just used some scrap plywood and cut a clean edge on it over at the table saw. Now, with my fence set, I won't touch my fence again because this will create a nice flush trim area on my sled. So next I flushed my template up against that freshly cut edge. Then I screwed on a couple of reference blocks to hold the workpiece in place while I cut it on the sled. To make sure the corners matched up in the correct spot, I just marked it out on the surface and used that to reference my piece against. Once I had the 2 reference blocks in place, I could screw on a 3rd block which is going to hold my clamps. These little hold down clamps will make sure that the workpiece stays flat and snug against the reference blocks. The cool thing about this sled is that it'll work for the repeatable cuts on all of my triangles, which makes this a cute cutting machine. So after I had double checked that the sled was set up correctly, I clamped in my first workpiece and cut it out over at the table saw. Now since I have the hold down clamps in place, I don't have to worry about putting any downward pressure onto the workpiece. My main focus here is to make sure that the sled slides against the fence smoothly. So with the first piece cut, I can then take the offcut, flip it over, and then cut that piece again. This leaves me with 2 identical triangles. The biggest thing is to make sure that the piece is fully seated against the reference blocks. If not, the angle could come out awkward and that could throw off the rest of the project. Now I'll be honest, this is probably the most nerve-wracking part for me because if any of these angles are off by a significant amount, it's going to be difficult to fix it later on. But if they're off by a small margin, there's a way we can cheat that, and I'll show you how I did just that later on in the build. So while I finish up the remainder of these cuts, if you're enjoying this video or you found it helpful and entertaining, please take a moment to give it a like. It lets YouTube know to share the video with more people and really helps me out. Thanks for your support. Alright, so with all my triangles cut out, I could do the first test fit of the circle. And I'd say we're about 97% there, so I'd say that's pretty good for where we're at right now. I wish they were perfect, but with this many compounded cuts, that was kind of unlikely. Alright, so next up was the first set of bevel cuts. Now to do that I'm going to use a tenon jig that I have set up for my table saw, which is just a taller external fence that slides along my table saw's fence. And I'll set this up the same way that I set up my horizontal sled, only vertical this time. So I attached a couple reference blocks with some screws, making sure the screws are nowhere near my saw blade, and then tilted the blade so I had a nice bevel cut from one end of my triangle over to the other. I use a featherboard to keep the piece snug against the fence, and then the reference blocks take over from there and hold the workpiece in place while it slides over the blade. Now since these triangles mirror each other, this jig's only going to work for half of the triangles. So I'll cut 12 of them this way, and then I'll have to reset and make a new jig for the other 12. It's also important to note that once this bevel angle and fence depth is set, it shouldn't be touched again, because we want the mirroring bevel to match, and it's going to be exactly the same setup, only reversed. Once I had cut bevels onto the right half of my triangles, I could flip the workpiece around and then attach 2 new blocks to cut the left side bevels. Once I had the reference blocks attached, the process for cutting the left side bevel was identical to the right side. The only issue I ran into here was that occasionally the workpiece slipped out of the reference blocks for this cut, so it did leave a couple burn marks that I'll have to sand out later. Since these 2 bevel angles are complements of one another, I don't have to worry about the math and they should line up perfectly. And unlike the kids of Hawkins, I was happy to see the upside down. Alright, so our next step was to cut out the angles which would make our on the hour markers. And again, these are going to mirror each other, so I'll cut the first 12 with my miter gauge set up in this orientation, then flip it to mirror it for the next 12. I chose to go with a miter gauge rather than a sled for these cuts because of its repeatability. I can set the miter gauge once, knowing it's going to hit my angle dead on, and then flip it to the other side and hit it dead on again. And hey, if this video is hitting the mark for you, hit subscribe. I make new videos every 2 weeks, so make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for your support, and I'll see you there. Now let's get back to the action. No, not that action, the other action, Shane. Alright, so with all my pieces trimmed to their final shape, I could start gluing things together. And to clamp my pieces together, I'm going to go back to my tried and true blue tape. I just squeeze the pieces together and put a strip across the top. Since blue tape has a little stretch to it, this will give just enough pressure to hold the joint tight. Once I've applied a small amount of glue to the joint, I flip the piece over and apply another strip. I then repeated this process for the remaining 9 sections. I chose to do it this way rather than glue up everything as one large chunk, because I feel like this gives me better control over how the joints come together. Not to mention leaving the incline in the center allows me to easily sand down any marks that I need to. Speaking of sanding, next I sanded each section up to 220 grit. I did this with my random orbit to save me some time, plus because I left those angles, the random orbit had no problem reaching those sections. If I glue these in the other direction, I'd likely be rounding over those joints. And while I am aiming for a subtle round over on the top edge, I don't want that at the bottom. So next I could repeat the earlier process of applying glue to the center of my joint and then folding each section closed and then using blue tape to clamp it shut. And I did this for each one of my sections, waiting for the glue to dry before attaching the next one. Once I had my main center pieces attached, I could attach the 2 end pieces, which are going to be singles at this point, to each half of my circle. And again, the reason we have these left over is because of our sanding dilemma. Or I guess I should say, sanding solution. With the glue dry and my 2 sides assembled, I sanded the backside flat to make sure that there was no deviations, and we had a nice flat surface to work off. And then from there it was time to do the little cheat we talked about earlier. Since I built this in 2 halves, I'm just going to trim away the center overlap by a smidge. This should give me 2 equal halves, and even though this is taking away a little bit, you shouldn't be able to tell once the piece is complete. So once I'd cut a new sled, I just used some double stick tape to stick the halves onto the sled. And then I took it over the table saw and I trimmed those sides flush. Again, this is going to give me 2 equal halves, and when they come together, it'll be a perfectly straight line. Here I was just weary about those thin offcuts that were coming back trying to get me. Little do they know I was a dodgeball champion in middle school. And hey, if you'd like to support the channel, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discount codes on plans and merch, an invite to the Discord server, and some other cool stuff. And to those who have already joined, thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Alright, so I've sanded everything down and I got my clock parts in. I do need to make a couple of blocks to offset the back of the clock by the thickness of the mechanism. Then we're going to get a keyhole into one of the blocks so that we have something to mount it to the wall, and we'll get this guy finished up. So let's get those knocked out. So the first thing I needed to do was thickness down one of those extra pieces I had from earlier. Then from there I could set up my keyhole bit over at my router table. And using the keyhole bit, it's a little bit tricky, but what I like to do is just take my piece, gently drop it onto the bit, and then move it forward slightly. Then I cut off the router and wait for it to slow down and remove the piece. Once I had my keyhole cut, I went over to the crosscut sled and cut out 3 2" by 2" blocks. These should act as perfect little standoffs for our clock mechanism. Once I had my blocks cut down, I went ahead and sanded them and put a small round over on them. Then I could take the clock face and drill a hole in for the clock mechanism before gluing on the blocks. This way I could prevent blowout from the back. If you'd like to use the items or tools that I've used in this build, I'll have links to a good amount down in the description. Just know that I do make a few pennies if you do purchase, but I wouldn't put anything in there I don't actually use myself. And if there's something you've seen that I don't have listed, just leave a comment and I'll drop you a link. And I feel like it's worth mentioning, the reason I'm using 3 blocks is because it'll allow the clock to balance well on the wall. But once I had the 3 blocks attached, I went ahead and burned my insignia onto the back, and then it was time for finish. And for the finish, I'm using an oil and wax-based penetrating oil. I like this because it's all natural and low VOC, plus if there's any issues in the future, it's easy enough to sand back and repair. Not to mention that once it's dry and hardened, it gives a really natural warmth to the piece. And with that, the only thing left to address was the clock hardware. Now the mechanism I chose comes with these wooden hands, but I really wanted them to pop and contrast with the walnut, so I spray painted them white. I just used some blue painter's tape to mask off the brass portions. Once it was dry, it was time to get the clock assembled. And thankfully this went together really easily. There's just one nut that holds everything together, and the hands just pop on. Which was great because I couldn't wait to see this thing on the wall. I can't tell you how happy I am with the way this one turned out. The mix-matched wood grain adds a ton of character, and those angles are ridiculously cool. Not to mention I was incredibly relieved that all the math worked out. So if you enjoyed this project and you want to see more like it, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, check out this video over here next, and I'll see you next time.